Destiny 2 has been a contentious game for most of its lifespan. From a game originally made for casuals with static roles and double primaries, to the glorious redemption of Forsaken in the Dreaming City, and then returning to half-baked game modes like Trials of Osiris, and universally reviled ideas like sunsetting, it's been a bumpy last 4 years. But buried beneath all this toil and trouble has been a gleaming bright spot completely new to the franchise in Destiny 2. I am talking about dungeons. These 3-man mini-raids debuted in the weeks following the Last Wish raid with the spectacle known as the Shattered Throne, an activity that garnered so much positive praise and acclaim that multiple more dungeons have been created, and the activity has become a staple of the Destiny franchise, boasting some of the most stunning visuals that the game has to offer, as well as granting a challenge to players somewhere between a strike and a raid. Dungeons really have become a key part of Destiny, but despite everything that dungeons have done right, I believe that they can become so much more. In this video, I'm going to explain how dungeons can evolve into a true pillar of the endgame PvE experience. We're going to discuss how we can up the ante for fire teams with increased difficulty and loot to match it, and we will then discuss what I think is the true potential of dungeons. That is, serving as the solo PvE endgame experience. And finally, we'll have a discussion about how we can spice up dungeons on a week-to-week basis, making the power grind less stale and offering some unique loot opportunities and enhanced difficulty options not before seen in dungeons. Let's jump in. So, first things first, I want to talk about how I'd improve the fireteam experience of dungeons. Bungie themselves have described dungeons as 3-man mini-raids, and they serve as an excellent introduction to 6-man raiding. While I ultimately see the true potential of dungeons being tied to solo play, I still think that doing dungeons with your friends is very fun, and as such, we should improve the fireteam-based dungeon experience as well. So, let's talk about how dungeons can be improved. The first thing that dungeons need is for the weapons from this activity to evolve into gear that is worthy of being called endgame caliber. Specifically, I believe that our current dungeon weapons should be upgraded into a new, higher tier of weaponry called pinnacle weapons, as part of my Weapons 2.0 construct that I've discussed in previous videos. To give a quick summary, this would mean that dungeon weapons would now have the following attributes. They would have the ability to reroll the masterwork. They would have 2 choices in each of the final 2 trait slots. They would have the ability to reroll 1 of the perk nodes on the gun, and finally, they would come with an additional intrinsic perk that is relevant to the activity in which the weapon was acquired. In addition to upgrading base dungeon weaponry to the pinnacle status, I would also introduce Adept Dungeon Weapons. These Adept Dungeon Weapons would have all the attributes of their pinnacle counterparts, but would also include an additional Adept mod socket, giving these weapons some extra spice befitting of the highest tier of loot in the game. Now, let's talk about how I'd structure the loot and the difficulty of dungeons with a fire team. I would introduce 2 difficulty options for dungeons. The first would be the standard normal mode difficulty that dungeons are today. In normal mode, dungeons would have no modifiers, no champions, and no other twists. This would simply be dungeons in their pure original form, but would still feature better loot than today. The second difficulty option would be a master mode. In master mode, dungeons would have a few modifiers that rotate week to week, there would be champions present, and all players would be under the contest modifier, which is currently only used for raids in their first 24 hours after launch. For those unfamiliar, the contest modifier drops the player's power level to 20 below all enemies within the activity. Grandmaster Nightfall Ordeals also do a version of this today, except in GMs, the player's power level is dropped to 25 below all enemies. For Master Dungeons, I would mimic the contest modifier present for raids, and drop the player to 20 power below all enemies. So, let's jump into the loot structure for each of these 2 difficulties. For normal dungeons, on your first clear per character per week, you would receive either a pinnacle weapon or a high stat armor piece, 5 spoils of conquest, which, for those unaware, is a currency used in the Deepstone Crypt to target farm raid loot, and 2 enhancement prisms for each of the 3 main encounters. If you complete the entire dungeon with no checkpoint hopping, I see you all jumping right to the Kel Echo for your pinnacle power drop every week, then the final boss of the dungeon will drop an additional 5 spoils of conquest, granting the player a total of 20 for a complete dungeon run. For all subsequent dungeon runs of the week on that same character, I would implement a similar loot structure to what Deepstone Crypt offers. That is, the ability to continue earning spoils of conquest from encounters, but not additional loot drops or mats. This would mean each complete run of a dungeon would grant you 20 spoils, 5 for each of the first 2 encounters, and then 10 from the final boss. And with these spoils, you would be able to target farm loot from the completed dungeon via a final chest that spawns after the last boss is defeated, mimicking the structure from Deepstone Crypt. The final chest at the end of normal dungeons would only include pinnacle weapons and armor with a 58 base stat total or higher. To unlock each purchasing option, the player would need to first acquire each piece of loot from the dungeon, just like how Deepstone Crypt does it. So, let's now talk about Master Dungeons. For Master Dungeons, on your first clear per character per week, you would receive either an adept weapon or a high stat armor piece with a 58 plus base stat and 2 plus 16 stats, 5 spoils of conquest, and 2 enhancement prisms for each of the 3 encounters. If you complete the entire dungeon, then the final boss would drop an additional 5 spoils of conquest, an ascendant shard, and grant 1 stack of a buff called Chosen by Darkness. This buff would allow the player to acquire 1 adept weapon or high stat spiky distribution armor piece from the final chest vendor. This buff will be lost upon leaving the activity, so the player must choose a piece of adept loot then and there. The system would work like this to prevent players from having to keep track of yet another currency, and also so players can't hoard Chosen by Darkness buffs and quickly obtain all new adept weapons in a future dungeon or raid. For all subsequent Master Dungeon runs of the week on a character, you would continue to earn 5 spoils per encounter, with an additional 5 spoils and 1 stack of the Chosen by Darkness buff for completing the entire dungeon. This would mean that the player would be able to acquire 1 pinnacle weapon and 1 adept weapon of their choosing for each full Master Dungeon clear. And finally, for subsequent platinum completions of Master Dungeons, aka defeating all champions, the player would have a high chance to earn an Ascendant Shard. Meaning, if you're tired of running Nightfalls or Trials for Masterwork materials, high-tier dungeons would now give you another path to masterwork your gear. And with all these improvements to Fireteam-based dungeons, let's turn our eyes to making dungeons into the premier solo PvE Endgame experience. Now that we've made dungeons better for fire teams, let's talk about what I view as the true potential of dungeons. That being the premier solo PvE endgame experience. When Beyond Light launched, it included a feature that quickly became beloved by the community: Solo Legend and Solo Master Lost Sectors. These high-level solo Lost Sectors provide a way to target farm exotics in the slot of your choosing, meaning if you're a Stompies addict like me, you have a way to relieve your desires and chase down some new shoes when the right Lost Sector rolls around. Considering the hugely positive reception to this small inclusion of high-tier solo play, I think it's time to expand the solo PvE endgame experience, and dungeons are the perfect candidate for this expansion. Bungie themselves have said that while they design dungeon encounters for 3-man fire teams, they deliberately leave each encounter open to be soloed. This is why, when Shattered Throne first debuted, Bungie included an emblem for completing the dungeon completely solo. Player perception was again hugely positive to this inclusion and acceptance of high-tier solo play, so much so that Bungie upped the ante and included emblems and other cosmetics for not just soloing the last 2 dungeons, but also for solo flawlessing them. These solo flawless emblems have become some of the most coveted in the community, not to mention how freaking beautiful the prophecy emblem is all on its own. I could talk about that for an entire video. In my last video, I discussed ways to improve Iron Banner, with my primary focus being how solo PvP players could acquire endgame adept level gear. In this video, my primary focus is on how solo PvE players can acquire endgame adept level gear. And with how Bungie designs dungeons with solo play in mind, they are the perfect avenue to make this happen. So let's talk about how I'd structure the loot and the difficulty of dungeons for solo play. For solo play, I would again introduce 2 difficulty options for dungeons. Note that these 2 solo options would be firewalled, similar to the firewalled options for past seasonal events like the Haunted Forest. So, no worries about someone on your friends list ruining your solo run-through. The first option would again be the standard normal mode difficulty of what dungeons are today, with no modifiers, no champions, or no other twists. It'd be just you and you alone versus the creatures of darkness within. The second difficulty option would again be a master mode, with rotating weekly modifiers, champions, and the 20 below contest modifier. This difficulty option would not be for the faint of heart, serving as one of the greatest challenges the game has seen to date, but offering worthy rewards. The loot structure for solo dungeons would be like if you shifted all the fireteam-based dungeon rewards down a difficulty tier. Thought of another way, a master dungeon with 3 people is about the same overall difficulty level of completing a normal dungeon alone. This is how we can properly incentivize sustained, long-term solo dungeon play and allow solo PvE players a fair shot at earning some adept weapons and masterwork materials. For normal solo dungeons, on your first clear per character per week, you would receive an adept weapon or a high stat armor piece with a 58 plus base stat and 2 plus 16 stats, 5 spoils of conquest, and 2 enhancement prisms for each of the 3 encounters. If you complete the entire dungeon, then the final boss will drop an additional 5 spoils of conquest, an ascendant shard, and grant 1 stack of the Chosen by Darkness buff, allowing the player to acquire 1 adept weapon or high stat spiky distribution armor piece of their choosing from the final chest vendor. And again, for all subsequent normal solo dungeon runs of the week on the same character, you would continue to earn 5 spoils per encounter, with 5 additional spoils and 1 stack of the Chosen by Darkness buff for completing the entire dungeon, letting the player acquire 1 pinnacle weapon and 1 adept weapon of their choosing for each full clear. Now, let's talk about master solo dungeons. For this option, on your first clear per character per week, you would receive double drops from each of the 3 encounters. This would mean 2 adept weapons or high stat armor pieces, 10 spoils, and 4 enhancement prisms for each encounter. If you complete the entire dungeon, then the final boss would drop an additional 10 spoils, 2 ascendant shards, and grant 2 stacks of the Chosen by Darkness buff. This would mean that the player could acquire 2 pinnacle weapons and 2 adept weapons of their choosing from the final chest vendor. For all subsequent master solo runs of the week on a character, you would continue to earn 10 spoils per encounter, with 10 additional spoils and 2 stacks of the Chosen by Darkness buff for completing the entire dungeon. This would mean that the player would be able to acquire 2 pinnacle weapons and 2 adept weapons of their choosing with each master solo dungeon clear, even beyond just the first clear. And finally, for subsequent platinum completions of master solo dungeons, aka defeating all champions, the player would earn a guaranteed ascendant shard and have a high chance to earn another ascendant shard, similar to the masterwork material reward economy seen in Grand Master Nightfalls. Master Solo dungeons would not be for everyone and would be one of the hardest things you can do in the game, but would exist as a true test of a solo player's might, with insanely generous rewards to match the accomplishment. And with all these improvements to solo play dungeons, let's turn our eyes to spicing up dungeons on a week-to-week basis. Now that we've improved the loot structure and the difficulty options for both fire teams and solo players in dungeons, let's discuss how we can make dungeons as a whole more interesting week over week. A feature that we know is coming to raids in the future, a weekly featured raid due to an accidentally leaked patch note, should also be a thing for dungeons. Look at how successful and popular weekly featured raids were during the last 6 months of Destiny 1, during its Age of Triumph swan song. There are a number of easy additions that could be made to dungeons to make them exciting each and every week. The first thing I would do with a weekly featured dungeon is simply make the featured dungeon the one that grants powerful and pinnacle level rewards for that week. While I personally love Prophecy, it'd be a great and easy way to make the power leveling process feel less stale each week, as one of the primary endgame activities would be changing. The Harbinger mission that grants a pinnacle power reward already does a good job of this, as the mission has 3 different routes and 3 different final bosses that cycle week over week to make the activity feel fresh and different over time. The second thing I would do with a weekly featured dungeon would be the addition of an exotic catalyst that can drop from the final boss. In Shattered Throne, I would add the Wishender catalyst as a drop from Duel Inkaru, with the catalyst granting Vorpal Weapon to the exotic bow, as its entire identity is about slaying wish dragons and other monsters, making Vorpal Weapon a perfect fit for this weapon. In Pit of Heresy, I would add the Xenophage catalyst as a drop from Zolmak, with the catalyst granting Feeding Frenzy to make the weapon a better option for ad clearing, seeing as it's already a monster DPS weapon against single targets. And finally, for the Prophecy dungeon, I would add the Malfeasance catalyst as a drop from the Kel Echo, with the catalyst granting the perk Big Boom, where defeating an enemy with its exotic perk, Explosive Shadow, causes a final explosion, basically a big Taken Goo firefly. And yes, I know that the Prophecy dungeon doesn't have an exotic specifically tied to it like Wishender or Xenophage, but I feel that the Malfeasance catalyst would be a fitting reward, considering the Drifter's involvement and the fact that it's basically his gun, and the dungeon takes place in his ship. These catalysts would have a chance to drop on all weekly featured dungeon completions, unlike the drop structure for raid exotics like Eyes of Tomorrow, which is only 3 chances per week. The drop rate for the catalyst would be increased for higher tier difficulty completions, meaning you'd have the lowest chance to receive a catalyst in fireteam based normal mode dungeons, a higher chance in either fireteam based master dungeons or normal solo dungeons, with an even higher chance in master solo dungeons. This would be another incentive to run dungeons at higher difficulty levels. The third thing I would do with a weekly featured dungeon is add a rare shader that can drop from the final boss. In Shattered Throne, I would add a Taken effect shader reminiscent of the Taken style armor sets from Destiny 1 and the Taken effect on your armor when you drink a tincture of Queen's Foil. In Pit of Heresy, I would put a Scarlet shader that matches the color palette of the expansion that it came with, Shadowkeep. And for Prophecy, I would add a light blue or light pink shader that matches the default color scheme of the Daito armor set from that dungeon. And again, just like with the exotic catalysts, I would up the drop rate of these shaders as you go up in difficulty tiers. The fourth thing I would add with a weekly featured dungeon is grant 1 additional Ascendant Shard per character that completes the entire weekly featured dungeon, no matter the difficulty level. So, if you're a more casual player that just wants to run the dungeon on normal mode with your buddies, this would be another way to earn Ascendant Shards each week. And finally, the last thing I would add with a weekly featured dungeon is a Grandmaster dungeon difficulty level. This GM dungeon difficulty would peg the player at 30 power below, include even more champions, only allow limited revives, with the only way to earn more lives being by killing champions, and would feature the Extinguish modifier, where if your entire fire team dies, you are sent back to orbit and your checkpoint is wiped away, making you start anew from the beginning. For fire teams, the GM dungeon would have the same reward structure as we discussed previously for master solo dungeons, i.e. double adept weapon drops per encounter. For solo players, if you have the balls to attempt a GM solo dungeon, you would see triple rewards as compared to normal solo dungeons, as this would be an extraordinarily difficult challenge, especially with Extinguish on. I can already see Esoteric licking his chops and saying, "Bring it on." GM solo dungeons would also make the dungeon's exotic catalyst and shader become guaranteed drops from the final boss. If you're good enough to complete a GM solo dungeon, you deserve the loot. Just take it. Please don't hurt us. And just like that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this latest installment and how we can continue to evolve Destiny 2. Dungeons have been one of the absolute best additions to the franchise that we have seen during Destiny 2's life. My first time going through the Shattered Throne was unbelievably awesome, and it's great that Bungie considers dungeons to be such an integral part of the game that the old raid team is now known as the RAD team, aka the Raids and Dungeons team. And I'll say this, if it wasn't for Prophecy, I might not have ventured into the YouTube scene at all. You see, up until the start of Season of Arrivals, I had primarily been a Trials and PvP streamer, all the way back to the Rise of Iron days. But that first weekend of Arrivals, Trials got canceled, and I decided that to fill the void, I'd take on the challenge of doing a solo flawless Prophecy run. That stream saw almost 500 people watching for the duration of the run, which was more than I had ever seen during all my years of PvP streaming. It was then and there that I knew I could branch out and become a Destiny content creator and not just a PvP service streamer. Dungeons had my back, and this video is me trying to have theirs. Before we go though, guys, I just want to say thank you for continuing your unbelievable support of this channel. If we can maintain the pace that we're on, there is a very real chance that we could hit 100,000 subs in a single year. That fact blows my mind, and it motivates me to keep cranking out the best content I can each and every week. As always, if you want to support this channel, make sure to leave a comment down below, drop a like, and subscribe. Have an awesome week, guys, and I hope to catch you all in the next one. This has been your host, Kujay. Cheers.